founding fathers that are responsible for the signing of the Constitution. Some of them are here. You have people like Alexander Hamilton in the news a lot today because of the musical Hamilton. I don't know how many of you have seen the musical Hamilton, but it's pretty good. You have people like George Washington, who was the president of the Philadelphia Convention, and he's the one who first called the Annapolis Convention. Very well respected. You have James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution because he wrote. He was the only guy given permission to write everything down, as I said. And then you have Benjamin Franklin, who was the elder statesman of the group, and they were a pretty darn good team, I guess you could say. I wanted to go over this quickly before I touch on the previous slide, but I got this out of a book that I read recently called The Story of America. It says, I took this quote, it said, "The founders are the greatest team ever fielded. You have somebody of great high rectitude, George Washington. You have a couple really brilliant people, Madison and Jefferson. You have very passionate visionaries like Sam Adams and his cousin John Adams. And then you have somebody who could bring them all together, who was Ben Franklin, the elder statesman here. So it's a pretty darn good team of men with different talents that came together to get it done." One of the most impressive things about the document is the amount of compromise that had to happen for it to actually pass. There were plenty of times in the weeks that they met in that very, very apparently hot summer of 1787, when the Constitutional Convention happened, where there was a lot of agitation because it was so hot. Plus, it was a very contentious meeting, but they had to compromise in order to get this done. There were so many different factions that were involved, whether it's rich people versus the common man, big states versus small states, southern states versus northern states, western states versus eastern states. You had all kinds of different factions, and it was going to be hard to get them to agree. The Great Compromise is a great example of the compromises. It is the biggest of all the compromises. When the question came up as to what do you do with Congress? Is Congress like it was under the Articles of Confederation, where it's one state, one vote, which is not fair to the bigger states like Virginia? Or do you go to some kind of system where the bigger your state is, the more representatives you get, which isn't fair to the smaller states like Rhode Island and New Jersey? Now, they were trying to hammer out some kind of a compromise, and they came up with a pretty impressive compromise. It becomes known as the Connecticut Compromise. Basically what the Connecticut representative talked about was having a Congress with two houses, one for the big state and one for the small state. Originally, the Virginia plan, the representative for Virginia got up and said, there's no doubt that we have to make this so that the bigger states matter. And he proposed that they would let population determine the amount of representatives. And the representative from Virginia stood up and said, then that's not fair. We'll be insignificant because we're so small. And they clashed, and the whole convention almost adjourned because of this issue. And that's when the Connecticut representative said, let's have two houses, one for the big states, one for the small states. So that's what we ended up getting. So we have a Senate that is for the small states. Every state has two senators, no matter how big your population is. So whether you're the biggest state today, California, we have two senators. If you're the smallest state population-wise, like Alaska, they have two senators, same thing. And then you have a second house, and it's called the House of Representatives, and the amount of representation you have in the House is purely determined by what your population is. For example, California has a huge amount in the 50s, mid 50s, 53, 54 members of the House of Representatives, whereas a state like Alaska has one. I think Alaska, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota have one representative in the House because of their small population. So that's what they came up. That was the idea. Every bill has to pass both houses, the Senate and the House, and then the president has to sign it. That's the system that we've come up up with. Now, any bills dealing with taxation, revenue, money have to originate in the House. And it's easy to see why that is because the bigger states are the one that pays the most in taxes, especially California. Not only do we have a lot of different taxes in the state of California, more taxes than any other state has, but we also pay the most because more people are paying. So any bill dealing with taxation or revenue must originate in the House. It cannot originate in the Senate. It still has to pass through the Senate, and a president still has to sign it or veto it. But that's how that goes. So the Great Compromise. There also is a compromise in election of the president. So for example, we have the Electoral College. The people do not directly vote for the president. That doesnn't happen. And we're embarking on an election year here. We have an election in about 30 days from now, and this is a good lecture that'll help you to understand how presidents are elected. The founding fathers wanted to make sure that they had the ability to change the decision of the common man if they didn't feel it was the right decision. Yes, you heard that right. Originally, the Electoral College was created to correct any wrongs by the common man. Remember, one of their goals at the Constitutional Convention was to curb mobocracy, to not have people have too much power. Give them power, give them democracy, but not too much. So here's the system that they came up with. Every state is assigned a certain number of electors, and the number is determined by the number of House of Representative members plus the number of senators. So everybody gets everybody has three at least electoral votes, 2 senators, 1 House of Representative member. And you could see on this one, Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota have only 3 electors, 3 electoral votes. Whereas California has 54. California has, at this time, this is an older map, but they had 52 members of the House and 2 senators for a total of 54. You look at Texas, and New York. New York has 33 members of the, or 33 electors. That's 31 plus 2 is 33. Texas, 32. So they have 30 members of the House and 2 senators, and that's how they get that number. These electors are chosen by the party. So for example, California with their 54 electors, they're actually going to have 108 electors, 54 of them from the Republican Party, 54 of them from the Democrat Party. Whoever wins the popular vote in California gets all 54 electors. So let's say California is pretty much a Democrat state. The Democrats normally win California. And let's say that Joe Biden wins California in a month from now. Joe Biden gets to send 54 electors to Sacramento a couple weeks after the election, and they cast their vote for Joe Biden. So it's a winner take all in 48 of 50 states, meaning if they win the state even by a single vote, they get all the electors. So that's the system that they came up with. And it's a pretty fair system when you look at it. I mean, there's a lot of complaints about the Electoral College today. We just had an election in 2016 where the loser of the election, Hillary Clinton, actually had more popular votes, way more popular votes than the winner of the election, Donald Trump. And that's happened before in history, a number of times that's happened. And people get upset about that because, well, should it just be purely the popular vote? Well, if that's the case, a state like Montana, their vote would mean virtually nothing, because their 3 electoral votes mean more than any one of their individual votes when you look at it. The winner of the election is the first to get over 50% of the electoral votes. As soon as someone gets 270 electoral votes, they are then deemed the winner of that election. So 270 is key. If it's 269 to 269, then the House is going to determine who the president's going to be in the unlikely event of a tie, which did happen in the 1800 election. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. We'll talk more about the election of a president in class. Just to get an appreciation for how big the state is that you live in, California. California at when this was printed had 38 million people. So you can see California here. Then it took 38 million, what it would take, how much territory it would take to equal the amount of people in California. So for example, all this brown area right here, that represents 38 million people. All this blue area down here, that represents 38 million people. The yellow area represents 38 million people, and so on. So this is a California-centric map, and it's to give you an idea of just how big California's population is. So that's why we have way more members of the House of Representatives. And by the way, how do we know how many people are in California? It's because of the census. We talked about it before. Is after the founding fathers said every 10 years we are going to count the number of people in the United States with a census. And ever since the first census in 1790, we've done that every 10 years. So it's 2020. This is a census year. Here's some interesting electoral college math to give you an appreciation for Wyoming. Wyoming likes this. The population of California is 38 million. The population of Wyoming is 584,000. California has 55 electoral votes. Wyoming has only 3. So it takes 705,000 Californians to equal 1 electoral vote. It takes 194,000 Wyomingites to equal 1 electoral vote. That makes every vote from Wyoming worth 362% what each vote from California is worth in the election for the president of the United States. So their vote means more because they live in a state with not that many people and they have 3 electoral votes. So that's why the Electoral College it gives people of Wyoming a chance to have a say in what goes on in the election. Another very important compromise was Southern states versus Northern states. Northern states wanted no slaves counted toward the population. Southern states wanted all the slaves counted toward the population when it comes to dealing with representation in the House. Of course, the South wants all their slaves counted towards the population because their population would be more, which means they would get more electors in the House of Representatives. And Northerners said that's not right. They're not considered citizens, so therefore should not be counted toward the population. So they went back and forth. They negotiated out a compromise, and it's known as the 3/5 compromise. So what it means that 3 out of every 5 slaves were counted towards the population, 3/5. They take the number of slaves and they take 3/5 of that number. A common question I get is how come they went 3/5 and not 1/2 or 1/3 or 2/3 or 3/5 was the number they came up with through negotiation. And that's it. That was a compromise between the Southern states and the Northern states. Also trade compromises too. When it comes to, one of the biggest reasons why the Articles of Confederation failed was because of inability to control interstate commerce. So when it comes to interstate commerce, any trade that happens between states, if a company does business in more than one state, then the federal government controls the trade rates. If a company does business in only one state, then that state handles it. So trade compromises. We know too that the founding fathers, I said earlier, that the founding fathers, were looking out for the money that they had in their wallet. They wanted to be able to keep that. Those men were rich, they were powerful, and they wanted to make sure that they maintained that power. So there are definitely guardings against the masses in the Constitution. Guardings against the common man is another way to say it. And here's five provisions of the Constitution that make it so that people don't have too much power. 1, federal judges are elected for life. Federal judges, anyone in the Supreme Court or the lower courts, they're elected. The federal courts, they're elected for life, meaning they're in there until they retire or die. Right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently died. She's on the Supreme Court. They're going through the process of picking someone new as one of the 9 justices in the Supreme Court. The president will nominate somebody, and the Senate has to approve. So again, we'll talk more about that in class, and you're about to see that go on in real lifetime. And two, the second one, judges are chosen by the president and approved by Congress. So those same judges, as I said, would be approved by the Senate. Three, the Electoral College, as I said, was originally for the founding fathers to change the decision of the common man if they didn't feel that was the best choice for president. Number four, the senators originally were chosen by state legislatures and not the people. We do now pick our own senators. That changed during the progressive period in the early 1900s. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution gives us the power to pick our senators. We get to vote on that as the common man. Senators, though, originally when this was written, the founding fathers believed that with only 2 senators per state, it was too important of a position to allow the people to vote on it, believe it or not. So as it is, only 1/2 of one branch was chosen directly by the people, and that was the House of Representatives. Only 1/2 of one branch originally. Now that's changed. One branch we do directly vote for, the House and the Senate. But we still don't directly vote for the president, and we still have no say in who the judges are. So guarding against the masses. As most of you know, the government that they came up with at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 has 3 branches. You have the executive branch, which consists of the president and the vice president, and also the cabinet positions. Then you have the legislative branch, it's Congress, is made up of the Senate and the House. And then you have the judicial branch, which is made up of the Supreme Court. The executive's main job is to execute, to enforce the laws. The legislative branch, they make laws, and the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, they try cases and decide the constitutionality of laws. They do a lot more, but that's the basic idea. We also have what's called the system of checks and balances in this country to make sure none of the branches, not one of these branches, gets too powerful. They want to check up on their power. For example, the executive branch, the president has veto power. A bill could pass the Senate, pass the House, and the president can veto it, and it dies. There's a way that the legislative branch could check up on the president. If a president just starts vetoing every bill, they could override a presidential veto with Congress. You have to get 2/3 of Congress to vote to override a presidential veto. That's hard to do because you're going to get people of the same party as the president that would have to go against what the president wanted. But there's other things that are put in place. The executive branch has the power to appoint federal judges, but then the legislative branch has the power to deny that. The Senate, they vote on it in the Senate. The judicial branch, their main power is called judicial review. They can deem laws unconstitutional. They have the final say on the constitutionality of a law. It could pass the House, pass the Senate, president signs it, but if the judicial branch rules that it's unconstitutional, that law dies. And if the legislative branch wants to start that process again, they have to create a new bill and change it and tweak it. And it has to be acceptable to the judicial branch. So anyway, the other thing too is a president can be impeached. Articles of impeachment are voted on in the House of Representatives. If there is a trial, that trial would be in the Senate. The judicial branch has a say in it, in that the Chief Justice of the United States would be the judge in that case. So there's a lot of different things in place, and I'll talk about a few more in class where the system of checks and balances has worked. It's being challenged now in the situation that we're in with the president that we have. It's been challenged many times, and we'll see what happens. But this is put in place and has been used many times to check up on presidents that have become too powerful, or at times when the legislative branch has had more power. The Constitution that was submitted has an intro. You know, we always talk about intros in here and contextualization. And here's an intro to the Constitution. It's the preamble. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That is the preamble to the Constitution. The Constitution is made up of the preamble plus Article 1, which deals with the legislative branch, talks about the Senate, talks about the House, how you're elected to the Senate, how you're elected to the House, and all the rules there. Then Article 2 is on the executive branch. Article 3 is on the judicial branch. Article 4 is about the states in general. Article 5 is about how you amend the Constitution. Article 6 is about the United States as a whole. And then lastly, how you ratify this document. And one of the things they talked about is when it comes to ratification is they weren't going to make it unanimous. It wasn't going to be something like unanimity was going to be necessary, but they needed 3/4 to ratify this document. There were many states like New York and Virginia that said, we will not vote for this very strong government that was proposed unless there is a Bill of Rights, rights that states and individuals have against a strong government. Because understand this, is the government that is created here is very similar to the government that the United States fought off in the Revolutionary War. Think about it. England has parliament, we have Congress. England has a prime minister, we have a president. There were a lot of Americans post-Revolutionary War that weren't comfortable with this form of government. But rich people wanted it. Most of the common man didn't, but they wanted it, they pushed it, but they did things like they put in a Bill of Rights. And the first 10 amendments guarantee powers like the freedom of press and religion. It's Amendment 1. Amendment 2 is the right to bear arms. We talked about the Quartering Act in the Revolutionary War, and people were appalled by the demand that England had for quartering of the redcoats. So they put in our government in Amendment 3 that government can't make citizens quarter soldiers. Freedom against illegal search and seizures and trial by jury. All these things are put in the Bill of Rights. And it was decided on before this document even passed, is that they were going to add these. These are kind of additions. These are additions to the Constitution. So that's the Bill of Rights. So there's a picture right there, Howard Chandler Christie picture of the delegates, the signing of the Constitution in the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. What you can't appreciate in that picture was how darn hot it was, one of the hottest summers on record in Philadelphia. And these men were baking in this room right here where they couldn't open any windows because it was so top secret. I don't know how important that is in the overall scheme of things, but just some interesting information. So you had two sides. You had the Federalists who believed that this was a good document and you have to vote for it. Everybody coming out of the Constitutional Convention their job was to go sell this document to the people, make sure that they support it, and they were going to have to rally the public and educate them on how important the Constitution is. And then on the other camp, you had the anti-federalists, who are the people who said, no, this government is exactly like the government that we fought off from England. So they went back and forth. The Federalist, pro-Constitution. Anti-Federalist, no, we need to go back and do something similar to the Articles of Confederation. They clashed, and eventually what happens is that ratification does happen. They were able to get 3/4 of the states to vote yes on that document. And the next thing they had to do is they had to pick a president. And they did. George Washington was running for president, and he was unanimously chosen in the Electoral College. Interesting side note, the Founding Fathers did not allow the people to vote in the first election, 1789. Everybody at the Constitutional Convention knew that they wanted George Washington to be president, and they didn't want to give the public the chance to not vote him in. So that's why the people didn't get the right to vote in the first election for a president. So you could see that here you have George Washington has won 100% of the electoral vote. The only president in history to do it. He did it in 1788 election. He did in 1792 election. Same thing. People didn't vote in that one either. Interesting to note here that North Carolina, like there states that didn't ratify the Constitution yet, were not allowed to vote. So yeah, North Carolina hadn't ratified the Constitution, didn't have the right to vote yet. Same thing, North Carolina and New York. So 9 of 13 were required to ratify this document, and eventually it did ratify it. New York was really skeptical about this government, thought it was too strong, and it was these three men, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, that wrote a series of essays. They're called the Federalist Papers, where they explained how important this government is and how it's possible to be able to run this type of government over a large area. That was a concern people had. How are you going to have a democracy with people spread out all over the place? But the Federalist Papers were written, and these three men became famous for writing those papers. And finally, the Constitution was ratified. North Carolina and Rhode Island finally ratified later on. It took them a while, but they did. It didn't matter. The government was going anyway. And we have the Constitution. If you ever want to see the Constitution, you could see the printer's copy of it at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And that's what the United States looked like in 1787.